Hello and welcome. We're at 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, so we will go ahead and begin the webinar. I see some people still logging on, but they don't need to worry because we are recording this webinar, so it will be available for viewing in the future. I am Melanie Ross, and I will be the facilitator of our webinar today. Our presenter is Patrick Selig. Thank you for joining ANAB for our complimentary webinar on the importance of sampling and ISO IEC 17025-2017. Again, please note, we are recording this webinar, so it will be available for viewing in the future. Some logistics before we get started. Due to the attendance, everyone will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box. We have planned time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions asked. Patrick Selig is an accreditation manager for ANAB. He holds a bachelor's and master of science in biology from Purdue University. While at Purdue, Patrick managed a university laboratory working with professors performing primary research on plant insect pathogens. Patrick has experience with various testing technologies and techniques, including DNA and RNA extractions, qPCR, RT-PCR, cDNA synthesis, southern-northern blots, confocal microscopy, cloning and transformations, primer design, and grant writing. He is also trained in medical cleanroom processes and IV chemotherapy drug preparation. Prior to joining ANAB, Patrick worked for F&V operations, supporting the city of Huntington, Indiana, and Roanoke, Indiana, with responsibilities for environmental water quality reporting to the health departments. He is currently employed by ANAB as an accreditation manager reporting out of the Fort Wayne, Indiana office. With that, I'm going to go ahead and transfer the ball over to Patrick so he can begin. All right, Patrick, you should have control now. If you want to unmute.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Melanie. Thanks for that introduction. And thank you all for joining me on the webinar to discuss the importance of sampling and ISO IEC 17025-2017. As Melanie said, I'm Patrick Selig, a manager of accreditation with ANAB, and I'm responsible for the accreditation of sampling organizations. So to start off, what is sampling? It's the act, process, or technique of selecting a representative part of a population for the purpose of determining parameters or characteristics of the whole population. Or as the VIM defines it, sampling selection and/or collection of material or data regarding an object of conformity assessment. This could be anything from a sample of fruits to fish in a lake or the water that the fish lives in. Let's use the example of a fruit to kind of expand upon. So a farmer will have a harvest of a fruit and they need to determine if they meet the requirements for pesticide limits on the fruit. Well, they can't really test all of the fruit, so they decide to take a number of bushels to analyze for pesticides. To determine if the whole harvest meets the requirement for, say, pesticide limit. So all of the harvest of the population in this example, and the selected bushels to analyze would be the samples collected. So in these pictures, the whole harvest is represented on the left of each picture, and the bushels or samples would be represented on the right, indicated by the arrows. And so why is sampling important? Well, it's important for several reasons. The entire population may not be able to be analyzed. We cannot analyze all of the water in a river, so it's important to take representative samples to analyze. Sampling is also important if we don't want to destroy the population to be analyzed. So using an example from the previous slides, the farmer's whole harvest can't be analyzed. You destroy all of the apples, like what are you going to sell? It also may not be economically viable to test the entire population. So let's delve a little bit further into the importance. Sampling might affect you more than you actually know. It's important for monitoring the environment. For example, recently polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, been the target of the EPA. These substances remain in the environment nearly indefinitely and can leach into water supplies, causing health issues. Lead's another hazardous material that's frequently sampled in our water supplies that, negatively affects us and many populations like Flint, Michigan. Sampling our food to look for pesticides. None of us want to be consuming pesticides or herbicides that are commonly applied to the field, so we need to sample them and test them. Sampling milk or other dairy products for pathogens is another example of sampling to protect us consumers from harmful foods. Sampling cannabis has been of recent interest as states begin to legalize medical and recreational cannabis. Many states have regulatory requirements on how much to sample and where to collect the samples from. For instance, in Michigan, at least 50% of the sample taken must be homogenized before testing. I recently had a friend purchase a house, and he had the house sampled for mold spores. You don't want to purchase a home and it be completely contaminated with mold. And sampling plants and animals important for determining population levels of endangered species or health of the populations. And sampling auto parts from manufacturing is important as well. You want to make sure the brakes on your car don't fall apart when you try to use them. So a selection of brake pads are tested. So when it comes down to it, the quality of the analysis is dependent on the quality of sample collected and how representative that portion is to the whole. For collecting contaminated or unrepresentative samples, the testing performed may not provide value to the user. So what do we need to do to collect a representative sample? Well, it starts even before the sampling occurs by developing a sampling plan. Sampling plan is detailed outline of which samples will be taken, at what times, and on which material, in what manner, and by whom. Sampling plans should be designed in such a way that the resulting data will contain a representative sample of the parameters of interest and allow for all questions as stated in the goals to be answered. So let's delve a little bit deeper into developing a sampling plan and why it's important. So in a sampling plan, we need to know what we're sampling. Is there a criteria for the selection of the sample and the number of samples that are needed to be collected? So in our farmer example, we would be sampling apples, or it could be any number of fruits, but we'll be fruits, vegetables. We'll be looking at apples. We want to exclude any rotting or heavily bruised apples, and we'd want to statistically determine how many samples would need to be collected to make an inference on the whole harvest. Next, we need to have a method as part of our sampling plan. Are there regulatory requirements that dictate what methods is to be used? In some cases there are. For instance, in cannabis industry, Michigan has regulatory requirements, as do many other states. And I know drinking water has plenty of requirements and methods specified. So we'll say for our example that we'll be using an internal method for the sampling of the harvest. Sampling plan needs to include any preparations to be made, equipment and calibration and/or intermediate checks. So if our internal method tells us that we need to collect a certain mass from the harvest as a percentage of the total harvest, we may need a calibrated scale to determine we have collected the correct amount of apples. In order to do that, we would need to check our scale and to verify it's still accurate and keep it calibrated. So we've got our method, what we're collecting, and our scales are calibrated. Where are we collecting these samples from? Do we pick the apples off the top of each bin? Do we grab some randomly? Do we need to set up a sampling grid? All of these things need to be considered and put into the plan. a farmer has several different properties, we may need to visit and sample each site, and we may need criteria for selecting the sites, or even a plan, and included in this plan, on which sites to visit. And does every site need to be sampled every year? So all of this needs to be taken into account when you're developing, a sampling plan. Moreover, a sampling plan needs to include when the samples need to be collected, how often, and possibly what time frame does the collection need to occur. Does the first harvest and second harvest need sampled? Do you do every other? Should we be sampling after the apples have been sitting in bins for 3 days? I highly doubt it. We should include and consider all of these inputs when developing the sampling plan. After the apples collected, does the farmer have reliable transportation to get them to the lab? Are coolers required? Does this transportation meet our time frame for when the testing needs to occur? Is preservation required for the samples? Now this overlaps a little bit with the previous slide, but preservation of the samples should be included in the plan. As a side step from the farmer example, collection of wastewater to test for E. coli. The treatment plant uses chlorine to disinfect the water. Samples will need sodium thiosulfate to remove any residual chlorine from that sample. So having a sampling plan is one step in the right direction for improving the quality of samples collected. However, some organizations will take it a step further and become accredited to ISO IEC 17025 2017 for sampling. ISO is an independent, non-governmental international organization that develops standards to aid organizations in developing quality systems for sampling organizations. The International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, added sampling to the 2017 version of the standard. These extra requirements are detailed in section 7.3 of ISO IEC 17025 2017, the general requirements for competence of testing and calibration laboratory standard. Another side step before we get into the standard, here's a definition for sampling from ISO 17000. Sampling, selection, and or collection of material or data regarding an object of conformity. So they also define a body that performs one or more of the following activities: testing, calibration, and now sampling associated with subsequent testing or calibration as a laboratory. So typically people will think of a lab as only testing or calibration, but now ISO has defined that a sampling organization is also considered a laboratory for the standards purposes. So now let's take a look at what requirements were added to the standard for these sampling organizations. So in clause 7.3.1, it reads, laboratory shall have a sampling plan and method when it carries out sampling of substances, materials, or products for subsequent testing or calibration. The sampling method shall address the factors to be controlled to ensure the validity of subsequent testing or calibration results. Sampling plan and method shall be available at the site where sampling is undertaken, and sampling plan shall, whenever reasonable, be based on appropriate statistical methods. So here it's telling us we need to have a plan and a method like we've discussed, and the plan and the method need to be on site when the sampling occurs, and be based on statistics when appropriate. So clause 7.3.2 goes a little further in describing what is needed in sampling method. The lists the selection of samples or sites, the sampling plan, and preparation and treatment of the samples. So all of those need to be included in the sampling method. 7.3.3 talks about what records need to be retained. So a reference to the sampling method used, the date and time of sampling, data to identify and describe the sample, for example, number, amount, name, Identification of the personnel performing sampling, identification of equipment used, environmental or transport conditions, diagrams or other equivalent means to identify the sampling location when appropriate, and then any deviations, additions to or exclusions from the sampling method and sampling plan. So those three clauses in Section 7 are the main additions to the standard for sampling organizations or laboratories. However, they're not the only clauses that apply to these sampling organizations. So all of the applicable clauses in the standard would still apply. For instance, I wanted to highlight Section 7.6 here, and particularly 7.6.1, which discusses the contributions to measurement uncertainty. It says when evaluating measurement uncertainty, all contributions that are of significance, including those arising from sampling, shall be taken into account using appropriate methods of analysis. This is important as sampling in general is considered to be the largest contributor to measurement uncertainty. Many times the evaluation of measurement uncertainty with respect to sampling will need to be determined experimentally. There are many more requirements detailed in ISO IEC 17025-2017, but I wanted to highlight some that were specific to the sampling labs and sampling organizations. Now with ANAB, we do have a few extra requirements for organizations that only perform sampling. These organizations, we refer to them as standalone sampling organizations, and this document here is ANAB's accreditation requirements for standalone sampling organizations, or AR 2257. The standalone sampling organization, the laboratory per that definition, whose primary activity is to carry out sample collection of substances, materials, products, or data for subsequent testing or statistical modeling. Now, this AR does not apply to laboratories who perform testing, as the requirements for AR 2250, the testing laboratory accreditations requirements, is more applicable. A standalone sampling organization seeking accreditation would be assessed to both ISO 17025-2017 and AR 2257. This document can be found at the link here if you're interested in looking at it. And in the final section of today's webinar, let's take a look at a few of the requirements within this AR. So in Section 1, standalone sampling organizations shall establish a procedure and develop plans to participate in activities to assure the quality of results. It's recognized that proficiency testing is not a usual and expected element in the accreditation of most types of sampling organizations. And then there's a note indicating a procedure and plan may include a process for the comparison of data. Clause 1.2 says simply if there's PT available or required by regulation, refer to AR 2250 testing laboratory accreditation requirements, as they are then applicable. This section is included as it's important that these organizations are able to assure the quality of the samples collected. As we discussed, sampling alone has one of the largest contributions to measurement uncertainty. So moving on to Section 2, it addresses calibrations and ensuring that any calibrations associated with sampling are traceable whenever possible through NIST or another NMI to the International System of Units or SI units. And items used to weigh samples or volumes to collect samples would be a few examples of where this section may apply. There are two additional sections if you're interested in becoming accredited as a standalone sampling organization. They address management system options and then use of ANAB logo. I'll let you review those at your own leisure. And finally, I wanted to touch back on what we've talked about today. So I hope you've come to the same conclusion as myself, and that sampling is incredibly important. There's applicability in everyday life, from the water we drink to the food that we eat and the homes that we live in. We walked through developing a sampling plan, finally reviewed some of the requirements from the standard and ANAB's accreditation program. I'll now pass it back to Melanie to move on with the Q&A portion of the webinar. Thank you guys so much.
Great, thanks, Patrick. I'm going to take control back and we'll move on. All right, well, thank you, Patrick. That was a really great presentation, going over the requirements of the standard and ANAB's additional accreditation requirements. We do have a few questions that have come through, but I want to give you time to think of those questions that you may have. So we'll get to those after we discuss some additional resources available for accredited organizations or laboratories seeking accreditation. Webcasts are free, pre-recorded videos providing additional information on accreditation and standard requirements. The ANAB webcast can be found at the web address here, and we have a variety of topics. These take about 5 to 10 minutes to get through, depending on the topic, and again, they are completely free. Webinars, similar to the one that we did today, are also free, and they're live informational sessions that we offer monthly on a variety of topics. You went to our webinar page to register for this webinar, so check back again and see what our webinar will be for May. Can't believe it's already May this year. ANAB also has a blog. The blog page has a wealth of information related to risk, accreditation, standard requirements, and many other topics. If there's a topic that you're interested in that isn't listed there, just give us a shout and we'll get a blog written for it. We also offer live, online, in-person, and self-paced training in many areas, including internal auditing, standard requirements, measurement confidence, and risk analysis. We have plenty of time for questions, and again, we are recording this, so if you do need to drop off, but you want to hear what questions were asked, you can just listen to the recording later. We'll get through all of the questions that we have, and if we don't have time to finish within the hour, which I think we will, again, we will be recording this, so you can just drop back in later. So let me minimize all my other screens here. So we have the first question, Patrick, is how and where is sampling acceptance criteria defined?
Okay, so typically that's defined either by the testing lab, and they'll either normally put, you know, samples are tested as received. So it's not explicitly mentioned other than in that section of 17025/2017. And as far as for a sampling organization, it depends on the method. So usually the sampling acceptance criteria would be within the method itself, or dictated by the regulatory body.
Okay, great. The next question, we actually had two come in that are similar. Does the sampling plan requirements apply to the subsampling of controlled substances received at a testing laboratory? And then the second one is, do the sampling requirements apply to laboratories that are only subsampling customer samples? Basically the same question.
Typically, no. Again, it is case by case, but for the most part, as long as you're not collecting the samples, the sampling selection doesn't apply to you, and it would apply for the samplers themselves or the organization performing the sampling for the lab, or for the testing lab. Sorry, I should refer to it as such. So subsampling isn't necessarily included in a sampling plan. Now, if your organization is performing both sampling and testing, you may need to include that.
That leads into the next question. It says, can laboratories be accredited for testing and sampling?
Yeah, and in circumstances where we'll be accrediting labs for that, we'll lean more heavily on the AR 2250 rather than the 2057, as the 2250, the general requirements for testing and calibration or testing laboratories, accreditation requirements document is a little bit more prescriptive on what needs to be done involving proficiency testing and things like that.
Okay, and where can the AR document be found?
It was at that link, and if you go to anab.org, if you go to testing laboratories, and then on the right-hand side, there should be, I believe it's accreditation documentation. Let me pull it up here real quick. Laboratories, and then if you go on the right, there will be ISO IEC 17025 documents. You click on that, and then you've got anywhere from applications to accreditation requirements to supplemental accreditation requirements and even technical requirements, all sorts of documents on that page.
Great, thanks. So it doesn't look like we have any, oh, wait, as soon as I said that, one came in. So here's the next one. Acceptance quality levels, or AQL, are mentioned in an old mill spec. Are there other current resources that can be recommended?
I don't know the answer to that question offhand. I'm gonna have to get back to you on that one.
Okay, so we will make note of that question and I will give Patrick your contact information and he can get back to you. I do know that there are some statistical guides that talk about sampling and what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable based on the sample size. But we'll definitely get some more information for you and provide you that after the webinar. Do we have any other questions? Okay, what are ANAB expectations or procedures documents regarding subsampling at a testing laboratory?
What are ANAB expectations or procedures? Documents regarding subsampling and testing.
So I would say, what are our assessors looking for at a testing laboratory that's only doing subsampling of samples that were received at the laboratory?
So I mean, you're gonna need a procedure, and you're going to need records following along with your procedure. Trying to remember back to an assessment I did and what was needed. So it's primarily that you're performing the subsampling to the procedure, as far as your scope of accreditation goes. So whatever procedure that you're listing on your scope that your test is using, and then if your test procedure or method dictates what procedure you need to do for subsampling, that's what the assessor is going to be looking at.
Yes, and then also, how does that subsampling impact measurement uncertainty, right?
Yeah.
That could be what do we want to look at as well.
Identifying contributions to the measurement uncertainty would be what you'd be looking at there.
Great. Are there any suggestions when it comes to sample homogeneity, such as for cannabis? That's a loaded question.
Yeah, I don't know if I have any suggestions. That's still a field that I'm learning. I can look into it and we'll get back to you on it.
Yeah, sample homogeneity is definitely a challenge in cannabis testing because you think of all the different parts of the plant that you can test, or if it's a infused product or something. So that's definitely something to consider when you're looking at the accuracy of the results. You touched on the sampling of cannabis in Michigan. Was that in regards to the growing plant or the flower? If so, do you know what the sampling recommendations were?
So I believe that was to both growing the plant and the flower. They had, if I remember correctly, differing sampling requirements for both. And then what was the second portion of the question?
Do you know what the sampling recommendations were? Well, those would be
No.
included in the regulation.
Yeah, they should be in the regulation. I can't remember what the MRA number is offhand. Yeah, we'll have to get back to you. I'll see if I can't get you a link to their documentation.
Okay, the next question, how can the pros and cons between the different sampling methods, such as random, convenience, stratified, etc., be determined?
So that's difficult, and it's usually dependent on what you're sampling. If you're talking about developing your own sampling plan, you're definitely going to need to look into that. Oh, for machine parts. I would use a multitude and see multiple different sampling methods and determine what's most cost effective, what's convenient, and then most importantly, what provides us with the best quality of sample. So looking at your measurement uncertainty and making sure that all the samples are being collected the same. So there's no best answer here. It's really specific, and sadly, parts manufacturing is another area that I'm not super familiar with.
All right, do we have any other questions? And then we have a couple that we'll get back to after the webinar. Oh, we got one more that came in. Can you provide guidelines for statistical sampling, hypergeometric, and non-statistical square root?
No, I'm not too familiar in hypergeometric and non-statistical at this point. I'd have to get back to you on that question.
Right, and as far as guidelines, as an accreditation body, we have to be cognizant of not consulting and not telling you how to do your sampling. So really it is, like Patrick said, dependent on what you're sampling, what the purpose of the result is, what the result's going to be used for, and a lot of different factors that take in risk and measurement uncertainty and all sorts of other things. All right, well, I wanted to leave you with this slide here with contact information. The email address in the middle, the ANAB@anab.org, can be used to send any additional questions that you have about this webinar or about sampling. Those actually get routed to me, and I can route them to the appropriate person. If you have any questions about training or you want to learn more about what we offer for training, you can email training@anab.org. And if you're interested in becoming accredited, either as a laboratory or as a sampling organization, you can contact our VP of Business Development, rmuse@anab.org. This webinar, as well as all of the other resources that we discussed today, including the accreditation requirements, are available at the ANAB website at www.anab.ansi.org. At this point, I'm going to stop the recording. And if you have any additional questions, again, you can email those to ANAB@anab.org. I want to thank our presenter, Patrick, today for providing us this information on sampling, and I appreciate all of you for attending and for the great questions that you asked. Have a great rest of your day.